This section outlines the process for the teardown and full factory remanufacture of a used RCF500 pump. The procedure includes replacing any parts that do not meet quality standards and all wearable components such as vanes, seals, gaskets, and bearings. Begin with a thorough inspection of the pump. The rotor should spin smoothly without any noticeable resistance and without any indication of grinding in the bearing. Move the rotor around by hand, feeling and listening for any friction, grinding, or crunching. Remove the filter box lid by loosening the star knob coming out of the top of the filter box. These knobs can be hard to remove sometimes. It's okay to lightly use a rubber mallet to help with this. Just be careful. Remove the stainless steel filter cartridge next and look down into the housing. Spin the rotor by hand and observe that all vanes are sliding properly in and out of the slots. This pump has oil sheen on the inside of the housing, the rotor, and the vanes, which is another good sign. Note that the filter box lid contains an O-ring seated in an O-ring gland around the outside radius of the lid. Use a 17mm socket to remove the bolts connecting the filter box to the pump housing. Be careful not to drop anything into the pump housing at this point. It's very difficult to retrieve any parts that have fallen into the pump from here, even with a magnet. The diverter assembly also uses 17mm bolts. Some of these bolts may be difficult to get a socket around. Breaking the paint off the bolt heads may help a little. In most cases, it's better to detach the filter box and diverter as a single unit unless service is required on these parts. The bolts securing the diverter to the filter box are fine thread stainless steel socket head cap bolts requiring a 10mm hex bit socket or Allen key. These bolts have blue Loctite applied to them to reduce the risk of them backing out and falling into the housing during operation. Some parts may need to be lightly tapped with the rubber mallet to remove. Keep an eye out for gaskets left over on these machined surfaces, as they may compress against the surface and be easily overlooked. Use the 8mm hex bit socket or Allen key on the socket head cap bolts, which are countersunk into the transition plate below the diverter. The transition plate assembly on this pump includes the backup valve, which should be inspected for cleanliness and smooth operation. The bottom plate, or pump side, of the backup valve should move freely. The diverter handle must be removed first to take off the top cap of the diverter assembly. This handle is tightened around the diverter vane shaft with a split collar. Loosen or remove the black socket head cap screw in the handle, and then insert a tool into the split collar to widen it for easy removal. Remove the 3 diverter cap bolts using your 13mm socket. There is a thick spring between the diverter vane and the cap, which maintains the vane in a sealed position during operation. So take care when removing the cap, as the spring could shoot it off. Pry out the seal from the diverter cap using a small pry bar or flathead screwdriver. Replace all seals during reassembly. Note the notch in the diverter housing and the end cap. These line up to ensure the vane is oriented properly in the housing, and the split pin coming out of the top of the vane lines up to the groove in the cap seen here. Remove the small bolts holding the fan guard using a 10mm socket. To assist with the removal of the fan, insert a long tool past the blades into the cooling fins to prevent movement of the fan during assembly. Loosen the split collar and set screw with a 10mm Allen key. Care should be taken to avoid rounding the socket head cap screw, as these screws can become seized easily. Once loosened, a pry bar may be used to separate the split collar and remove the fan from the drive shaft, similar to the split collar on the diverter handle. Next, disconnect the fan shroud from the pump housing using a 10mm socket. After removing the fan shroud, the end cap can be removed by taking off the remaining 4 bolts with your 17mm socket. It may be necessary to disconnect one or both of the oil lines to access all of the bolts in the end cap. The oil line fittings are brass and easily damaged, so take care when working on them. Use a 13mm box wrench for all of the oil line fittings. Now the oil reservoir can be removed. Next, drain the oil from the reservoir by removing the 3/8" square plug on the bottom of the reservoir. Remove the long bolts connecting the reservoir cover to the seal housing with a 10mm socket. With the oil reservoir cover off, the internal lines and oil pump can be removed. The presence of water in the reservoir is typical, but best practices recommend draining before each use using the small 3/8 plug on the bottom of the reservoir. Remove the internal oil lines to access the final bolt securing the end cap. Use the 13mm box wrench for all of the oil line fittings. Detach the oil pump from the large seal housing with the 10mm hex bit socket or Allen key if it's a Fruitland oil pump. If it's an older Becca pump, use the 10mm box wrench.
There is a gasket behind the oil pump which should be replaced as well. With the internal oil pump and lines removed, the large seal housing can be removed with the 13mm socket, which exposes the bearing in the end cap. You can now remove the non-drive end cap with the 17mm socket. If removing the bearing from the end caps, note the presence of the two wave springs on the top of the bearing and note their position as such. The next step is to remove the shroud. In this factory remanufacture, we will be replacing the shroud altogether so we can grind off the screws.
The screws can also be removed with a small Phillips head driver to save the shroud.
Take the M10 eye bolts off of the pump and mount them to two of the flange holes to lift the pump up. The shroud can only be removed once the bases are off.
Inspect the rotor for any signs of overheating indicated by discoloration or a loose inner bearing race on either shaft end, and look for any other visible damage. Exercise caution when handling the rotor due to its weight and rigging requirements. Check the inner bore of the pump housing for wear or damage. Remove the plugs in the housing if it will be put through any sort of wash procedure. This pump will go through a parts washer, so the plugs are coming out. Ensure all gaskets are removed.
At this point, all of the pump parts are disassembled and are able to be inspected for signs of damage or wear. For this factory remanufacture, all parts will be cleaned thoroughly before final inspection.
This concludes the teardown and inspection of a used Fruitland 500 pump.